The Rise and Fall of Charlie Kirk, What Really Happened, 1993 to 2025, is not just another story, it's a shocking journey through power, influence, ambition, and downfall. Once hailed as one of the most influential voices of American conservatism, Charlie Kirk built an empire that promised to change the political landscape forever. But behind the lights, cameras, and speeches, there was a darker reality unfolding, one filled with controversy, betrayal, and hidden truths that few dared to expose. From his rapid rise to fame as the founder of Turning Point USA, to the endless waves of media scandals, internal conflicts, and ideological battles that surrounded him, Kirk's story became a mirror reflecting the complex and often dangerous relationship between politics, fame, and power. Many called him a genius strategist, while others accused him of manipulation and hypocrisy. Was he a victim of his own ambition, or the architect of his own collapse? In this video, we uncover the events that led from his meteoric rise to his ultimate fall, revealing the side of Charlie Kirk that the public was never meant to see. Every moment, every headline, and every hidden deal will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of America's most polarizing figures. So before you continue, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, not just to support this channel, but because YouTube's algorithm only recommends our content to viewers who engage, and your subscription helps us keep bringing the stories they don't want you to hear. If you can, support the channel even further by clicking the Super Thanks button. It helps us stay independent and continue to dig deep into these untold American stories. And if you can't, simply leave a comment below telling us what part of Charlie Kirk's story shocked you the most. Your opinion matters more than you think. Stay with us until the very end, because the final revelation will leave you speechless, and it might just change the way you see the truth forever. Charlie Kirk's story begins not in the grand halls of political power or on television stages, but in the quiet suburbs of Arlington Heights, Illinois, where he was born on October 14th, 1993. He grew up in an ordinary, middle-class American household, the kind that reflected the values of hard work, faith, and self-reliance. His father, Robert Kirk, was an architect, a man devoted to his craft and meticulous in his attention to detail. His mother, a homemaker deeply involved in her community, was known for her empathy and discipline. Together, they raised Charlie in an environment that emphasized personal responsibility and respect for traditional American ideals. From an early age, Charlie showed a keen curiosity about how things worked, not just machines or structures, but systems, people, and ideas. While other kids were obsessed with sports, video games, or television, he was fascinated by how societies functioned, how leadership shaped communities, and how ordinary people could make extraordinary changes if they had the courage to speak up. In school, Charlie wasn't the star athlete or the most popular kid. Instead, he was the one who sat in the back of the classroom, observing, thinking, and questioning everything. Teachers often described him as outspoken and unafraid to challenge authority, not in a rebellious way, but as someone genuinely curious about how rules were made and why people followed them. He often debated with classmates about history and economics, surprising many with his maturity and his ability to articulate arguments far beyond his age. His fascination with politics wasn't something he stumbled upon accidentally. It was born out of a deep sense of wanting to understand the principles that made America unique. Charlie's teenage years coincided with a period of growing political division in the United States. The late 2000s and early 2010s were filled with heated debates about economic crises, social movements, and the role of government. For many young people, these were abstract issues. For Charlie, they were puzzles he felt compelled to solve. He spent hours reading political blogs, listening to talk radio, and watching televised debates. While most of his peers were drawn to pop culture icons, Charlie's heroes were conservative thinkers and commentators who spoke about freedom, capitalism, and personal responsibility. It was around this time that he discovered figures like Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, and William F. Buckley Jr., whose words resonated deeply with him. Their ideas about free enterprise, individual liberty, and limited government struck a chord, shaping the worldview he would later champion. By high school, Charlie had already begun to develop the confidence that would define his career. He joined his school's debate team, not just for the competition, but because he found joy in persuading others through logic and passion. His classmates often underestimated him because of his calm demeanor, but once he began speaking, his arguments commanded attention. He had a knack for simplifying complex ideas, breaking them down in ways that made sense even to those who disagreed with him. This ability to communicate with clarity and conviction would later become his greatest weapon. One of the most formative experiences of his youth came during his time at Wheeling High School. Unlike many future political figures who attended elite private institutions, Charlie's education was grounded in public schooling, a setting that exposed him to a wide range of perspectives and social realities. He saw firsthand the ideological divides among students and teachers, and he often felt outnumbered when expressing conservative opinions. But instead of silencing him, this opposition fueled his determination. He began to see himself as a defender of ideas he believed were being ignored or attacked in mainstream education. To Charlie, it wasn't about winning arguments for ego's sake. It was about standing up for what he thought was right, even if he stood alone. His first real taste of political engagement came when he volunteered for a local Republican campaign. He wasn't paid, and he wasn't old enough to vote, but he showed up every day, organizing flyers, making phone calls, and speaking to voters. The experience gave him a glimpse into how campaigns operated: the energy, the strategy, the competition, and the importance of connecting with ordinary people. He discovered that politics wasn't just about speeches and policy papers. It was about stories, relationships, and emotion. That realization changed everything for him. He began to see politics as a form of storytelling, a way to shape how people understood their own lives and their country. At home, Charlie's parents encouraged his curiosity, but also reminded him of the importance of humility and hard work. They didn't come from wealth or privilege, and they made sure he understood that success was earned, not given. His father's discipline and his mother's compassion formed the two pillars of his personality: the drive to achieve and the desire to serve. Even as a teenager, Charlie believed he was destined for something bigger, though he couldn't yet define what it was. He once mentioned in an interview that while other kids dreamed of becoming athletes or celebrities, he wanted to change how young people think about America. That ambition, though audacious, became the seed that would later grow into a full-fledged movement. Ironically, Charlie's rise didn't begin at an Ivy League university like Harvard or Yale, where many political figures launched their careers. In fact, he never completed college. After high school, he briefly considered attending Baylor University, but decided to dedicate himself entirely to activism instead. For some, that decision seemed reckless, but for Charlie, it was an act of conviction. He believed that the best education came not from classrooms, but from real-world experiences, debates, and failures. In his mind, passion and purpose could achieve more than degrees and titles. This bold move set him apart from his peers and became one of the defining moments of his early life. As he entered his late teens, Charlie began attending political conferences and events across the country. At one of these events, he delivered a short but electrifying speech that caught the attention of influential conservative donors. He spoke about how young Americans were being taught to distrust capitalism and idolize government dependency, arguing that the true spirit of America lay in freedom, risk-taking, and entrepreneurship. His words were sharp and confident, and though he was only 18, he sounded like someone who had been speaking for decades. After that moment, opportunities began to multiply. Invitations to speak, mentor offers, and donations started coming in, giving him the foundation he needed to build something of his own. That something would become Turning Point USA, but even before its founding, Charlie's ambitions were clear. He wanted to awaken a generation, to build a movement that didn't just argue politics, but changed the culture. He often said that politics was downstream from culture, that if you could shape how people thought and felt, you could change the country itself. This understanding of persuasion, branding, and influence would become the core of his future success. In private, however, Charlie was still a young man grappling with self-doubt and the weight of expectations. Friends from that time described him as intense but polite, ambitious but reserved. He didn't party or waste time. He read, planned, and networked. He seemed older than his years, as if he were always thinking 2 steps ahead. Those who knew him best say that he believed in his mission with almost religious conviction, a belief that his work had a higher purpose. That conviction, while admirable, also made him inflexible at times, unwilling to compromise or see alternative viewpoints. His early ambitions were not just political, they were deeply personal. He wanted to prove that someone from normal background could challenge the elites who dominated American discourse. He wanted to be a voice for the youth who felt unheard, a symbol that conviction mattered more than credentials. Whether you agreed with him or not, it was impossible to ignore his drive. He wasn't following a roadmap. He was creating one. By the time he reached 19, Charlie Kirk was no longer just another politically curious teenager. He was a young man on a mission. He had a vision, cause, and the courage to pursue both without fear of failure. His early life, marked by curiosity, conviction, and relentless energy, laid the foundation for everything that came next. It was the story of a boy who dared to believe that he could rewrite the rules of belief that would carry him to unimaginable heights, but also, years later, to the center of controversy, admiration, and downfall. When Charlie Kirk founded Turning Point USA in 2012, he was just 18 years old, a teenager with a vision that many dismissed as naive, even laughable. But behind that youthful face was a mind already shaped by deep conviction and a relentless desire to influence how young Americans saw their country. The story of Turning Point USA isn't simply the tale of a political startup. It's the story of how one determined young man turned frustration into a national movement. It all began shortly after Charlie graduated from Wheeling High School. At the time, he was supposed to start college. He had been accepted to Baylor University, but something inside him resisted. He felt that the classroom wasn't where his future was meant to unfold. While others dreamed of academic success or stable careers, Charlie wanted something different. He wanted impact. He had spent years feeling like conservative ideas were being silenced on campuses, overshadowed by a growing culture of political correctness and left-wing activism. To him, the problem wasn't just ideological, it was generational. He saw young Americans becoming disenchanted with capitalism, increasingly skeptical of free markets, and dependent on the government. And in his eyes, that trend was dangerous for the future of the country he loved. The idea for Turning Point USA was born from that realization, a grassroots organization dedicated to defending free markets, limited government, and individual freedom, especially among students. He envisioned a movement that would be modern, youthful, and media-savvy, something that could speak the language of a generation raised on memes, hashtags, and viral videos. Charlie wasn't trying to create another conservative think tank. He wanted an army of passionate young people who could challenge professors, question authority, and bring conservative values back into the heart of American campuses. In the beginning, the operation was small, almost comically so. There was no office, no staff, and barely any money. Charlie worked from his childhood bedroom, using a borrowed laptop and a cheap cell phone to contact anyone who would listen. He spent hours cold calling potential donors, emailing business leaders, and reaching out to conservative organizations for support. Most ignored him. Some laughed. A few gave him polite rejections. But Charlie's persistence bordered on obsession. He believed that if he could just get one person to see his vision, everything would change. That person turned out to be Bill Montgomery, a retired businessman from Chicago who met Charlie at a political event. Montgomery was impressed by the young man's passion and clarity of thought. He saw in Charlie the kind of drive that reminded him of the American dream itself, ambitious, idealistic, and unstoppable. The two became close allies, and Montgomery helped Charlie turn his abstract vision into a structured organization. Together, they created the blueprint for Turning Point USA, defining its mission, core principles, and long-term goals. Montgomery also became a mentor and father figure, guiding Charlie through the rough beginnings of the nonprofit world. The early days of Turning Point were grueling. Charlie and a handful of volunteers traveled across the country in old cars, setting up tables at college campuses, handing out flyers, and talking to anyone who would stop to listen. They were often met with hostility not just from students who disagreed, but from faculty who saw them as troublemakers. There were times when they couldn't afford hotels, so they slept in their cars. They survived on fast food and small donations, sometimes just enough to cover gas. But every time someone signed up, every time a student showed interest, Charlie felt that the mission was working. He wasn't just building an organization, he was planting an idea. His ability to connect with young people was his greatest strength. He didn't lecture, he conversed. He didn't present conservative ideas as outdated dogma, but as principles of empowerment and independence. He spoke about entrepreneurship, personal responsibility, and self-determination, themes that resonated deeply with students who felt lost in a system that encouraged conformity over creativity. Slowly, the movement began to grow. By 2014, Turning Point USA had chapters in dozens of colleges and high schools across the country. Charlie's use of social media played a crucial role in this rise. He understood the power of attention long before it became a political science. While others dismissed Twitter and Instagram as distractions, Charlie saw them as tools, weapons, even to shape narratives. He began creating short, provocative posts that sparked debate and controversy. The posts were simple but effective, bold statements that could be shared easily, designed to challenge the reader. It wasn't about long essays or policy discussions. It was about cultural dominance. And in the age of virality, that approach worked brilliantly. His youthful energy and charisma caught the attention of conservative donors, many of whom were looking for a fresh face to represent the next generation of political activism. He received support from influential figures within the Republican Party, as well as business magnates who admired his entrepreneurial spirit. With more funding, Turning Point USA expanded rapidly, hiring staff, opening offices, and hosting national conferences. Charlie's dream was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, powerful, and growing at a rate no one expected. By 2015, the organization was organizing massive student summits, drawing crowds of thousands. These events were part pep rally, part political theater, loud, passionate, and unapologetically conservative. Speakers included well-known politicians, media personalities, and influencers. And at the center of it all was Charlie Kirk, often dressed in his signature suit and holding a microphone, walking across the stage with the confidence of someone who knew he was making history. But with success came criticism. Opponents accused Turning Point USA of oversimplifying complex issues and creating an us versus them mentality on campuses. Others questioned its funding sources and internal practices. Some even accused Charlie of exploiting the very students he claimed to empower, turning activism into a business model. Charlie, however, brushed off the criticism. To him, it was proof that he was making an impact. In his view, you couldn't change the system without upsetting those who benefited from it. Still, even in those early years, there were signs of the challenges ahead. The rapid growth of Turning Point created internal pressure, managing hundreds of chapters, keeping donors satisfied, and maintaining the image of authenticity that had fueled the movement. Charlie was everywhere, speaking at events, giving interviews, managing crises, and the pace began to take a toll. Friends recall that he rarely rested, often staying up late responding to emails and planning the next move. He was addicted to momentum. Despite the chaos, there's no denying that the founding of Turning Point USA was one of the most remarkable entrepreneurial stories in modern American politics. What started as a teenager's frustration turned into a multi-million-dollar organization that would go on to shape the political consciousness of an entire generation. Charlie had taken the tools of the digital age, marketing, social media, branding, and applied them to ideology, creating something new, a political brand that felt like a lifestyle. Looking back, those who were with him in the early days described that period as electric, a mix of idealism, exhaustion, and purpose. They remember sleeping on floors, arguing over strategy, laughing through failure, and cheering small victories. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. They believed they were building something historic, and in many ways they were. For Charlie Kirk, The founding of Turning Point USA was not just a career move, it was a mission. It combined everything he loved: communication, leadership, and conviction into one unstoppable force. It gave him identity and purpose, turning a restless teenager into a national figure. But it also marked the beginning of a journey that would test his ideals, his endurance, and ultimately, his character. Because while Turning Point USA would lift him to unimaginable heights, it would also pull him into a whirlwind of controversies, alliances, betrayals, and battles that would define the rest of his life. The boy who once dreamed of changing minds on campus was now at the center of America's most divisive political storms. And for Charlie Kirk, there was no turning back. By the mid-2010s, Charlie Kirk had become more than just a young activist. He was a brand, a phenomenon, a symbol of a new political generation. What began as a grassroots student movement was now evolving into a powerful national platform, and its young founder was quickly turning into one of the most recognizable faces in American conservatism. The pace of his rise was astonishing. In just a few short years, Charlie had gone from handing out flyers in university hallways to shaking hands with senators, giving speeches at major political conferences, and appearing on primetime television. For a teenager who had once felt ignored by the mainstream, the spotlight was both intoxicating and inevitable. The key to Charlie's success was timing. America was in the middle of a political transformation. The cultural battles of the 2010s over speech, identity, and ideology were dividing campuses, families, and even workplaces. The traditional media landscape was collapsing, giving rise to social networks where controversy was currency. In that environment, a figure like Charlie Kirk thrived. He was articulate, bold, and unafraid of confrontation. He knew how to turn arguments into headlines, and headlines into influence. With every debate he entered, every viral video he shared, he grew his audience and deepened his message. Television producers loved him. He was young, confident, and polarizing, the perfect recipe for ratings. Networks like Fox News began inviting him regularly to discuss politics, youth culture, and free speech on campus. Each appearance drew more attention to him and to Turning Point USA, which was rapidly becoming a household name among conservatives. His quick wit and fast-talking style made him stand out, especially when he debated seasoned journalists or liberal commentators. Audiences admired his composure under pressure. Critics accused him of arrogance. But either way, people watched, and that was what mattered. At rallies and conferences, Charlie began commanding stages with the confidence of a veteran speaker. He didn't just read speeches, he performed them. He knew when to pause, when to raise his voice, and when to make eye contact with the crowd. His message was simple. America was under attack from within, from universities that silenced free speech, from media that manipulated truth, and from politicians who valued power over principles. He presented himself not just as an activist, but as a defender of America's founding ideals. And for a generation of young conservatives who felt alienated and unheard, he became a voice of belonging. The rise of social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and later TikTok played directly into his strengths. Charlie had an instinct for virality. He posted short, sharp messages that could be shared by millions within hours. Sometimes they were inspirational, sometimes provocative, but they always sparked engagement. He turned conservative talking points into digital ammunition, and in doing so, he redefined what political influence looked like in the digital age. By 2016, his visibility skyrocketed even further. Turning Point USA had grown into a nationwide movement with thousands of student chapters. Its events were massive productions, complete with lights, music, celebrity guests, and social media influencers. Charlie was no longer the scrappy teenager fighting to be heard. He was the CEO of an ideological empire. He began to travel constantly, giving speeches in every corner of the country, meeting donors, and cultivating relationships with high-profile figures within the Republican Party. One of the biggest turning points in his career came during the 2016 presidential election. As the political landscape fractured and passions rose, Charlie and his organization positioned themselves as a key force in the youth conservative movement. His open support for Donald Trump earned him both admiration and backlash. To his followers, he was brave, a young man standing firm in his beliefs despite enormous opposition. To his detractors, he was opportunistic, using controversy to climb higher. But the truth lay somewhere in between. Charlie understood that controversy was power. The more people talked about him, even negatively, the more influential he became. After the election, his proximity to power grew even stronger. He began appearing at events alongside political heavyweights, attending private meetings in Washington, and receiving personal invitations to the White House. He had achieved what few his age could even imagine: direct access to the center of American politics. Turning Point USA flourished under this new visibility, securing massive donations from wealthy backers who wanted to see the next generation of conservatives mobilized. Yet with fame came scrutiny. Journalists began investigating the organization's finances, and watchdogs questioned how donations were being used. Allegations of internal conflicts, favoritism, and mismanagement began circulating. Some former employees described Turning Point as a cult of personality, built entirely around Charlie's image. He brushed off the criticism publicly, calling it media bias, but privately, he was aware of how fragile fame could be. The same platforms that had built him could destroy him overnight. Despite the growing criticism, Charlie continued to expand his influence beyond politics. He launched a podcast, wrote books, and appeared on countless interviews and digital shows. His content covered not only political commentary, but also culture, religion, and philosophy. He began framing his message in moral and even spiritual terms, portraying his mission as one of saving America's soul, not just its policies. This blend of faith, nationalism, and youth activism created a powerful emotional connection with his followers. For many, he wasn't just a political figure, he was a leader of a movement, a symbol of conviction in a world of compromise. But this level of fame came at a cost. Charlie's life became a blur of airports, hotel rooms, and conference stages. Every tweet, every speech, every public appearance was dissected by fans and enemies alike. Supporters adored him, critics mocked him, and the constant attention left little room for reflection. Those close to him began noticing changes. He was more guarded, more calculating, less willing to trust. The cheerful, ambitious young activist from Wheeling High School was slowly transforming into a hardened political figure, one who understood that influence was a double-edged sword. As Turning Point's influence grew, so did its controversies. The organization's social media campaigns sometimes crossed a line between activism and provocation. Videos edited to mock opponents, misleading statistics, and inflammatory language drew massive attention, but also fueled accusations of dishonesty. Critics argued that Charlie's tactics were contributing to the polarization of American society. He countered that he was simply fighting fire with fire, that the left had controlled culture for too long, and now conservatives were finally learning to play by the same rules. His ability to attract media attention made him both valuable and vulnerable. Every word he spoke could become a headline. Every mistake could become a scandal. There were days when he seemed to thrive on the chaos, and others when the pressure was visibly wearing him down. But in public, he remained confident, smiling, always ready with a quote or soundbite. He understood that in politics, perception is reality, and he was determined to control his narrative, no matter the cost. By the late 2010s, Charlie Kirk had achieved what many called impossible. He had turned conservative youth activism into a mainstream movement. Turning Point USA had chapters in nearly every state, annual conferences that drew thousands, and millions of followers online. He was now one of the youngest and most recognized voices in American political commentary, a man whose words could inspire, divide, or enrage with equal force. Yet, beneath the polished image and the flashing lights of media success, cracks were forming. The same ambition that had driven him to greatness was beginning to consume him. The endless demands of leadership, the pressure to stay relevant, and the criticism from both sides of the political spectrum began to erode the sense of purpose that once fueled him. He had built an empire on conviction, but maintaining it required constant conflict. Charlie's rise to fame was meteoric, but meteors burn brightest just before they fall. Every speech, every headline, every viral moment brought him closer to both triumph and tragedy. He had become a symbol not just of youthful ambition, but of the modern age of politics itself, loud, passionate, polarizing, and unsparingly public. In those years, Charlie Kirk was at the height of his power, but behind the camera flashes and the standing ovations, the weight of that power was growing heavier. The movement he built was no longer just his, it had become something bigger, something unpredictable, something that would soon test every principle he claimed to stand for. The rise was complete. The fall was only beginning. Every meteoric rise comes with its shadows, and for Charlie Kirk, those shadows grew longer as his fame reached its peak. By the time Turning Point USA had become a national powerhouse, criticism was following him everywhere he went. Admirers saw a bold young visionary who had built a movement from nothing. Detractors saw a manipulative figure who had mastered the art of outrage for personal gain. For Charlie, controversy wasn't an obstacle, it was part of the game. But as his profile grew, the controversies surrounding him began to blur the line between calculated provocation and genuine scandal. From the outside, Turning Point USA looked unstoppable. It had chapters on hundreds of campuses, high-profile sponsors, and a massive online presence. But inside, things were not as seamless as the public image suggested. Former employees began describing the organization as intensely hierarchical and driven by image over substance. Reports surfaced of toxic internal dynamics, long hours, pressure to maintain loyalty to Charlie, and a focus on fundraising numbers above actual activism. Some ex-staffers claimed that questioning leadership decisions could cost them their position. For many, it began to feel less like a grassroots movement and more like a carefully orchestrated brand built around one man's persona. These internal issues were compounded by external accusations. Critics accused Turning Point of promoting misinformation and using sensationalism to attract young audiences. Some pointed to questionable statistics used in its campaigns, claiming that the organization exaggerated data to push political narratives. Journalists began digging deeper, examining its finances and political connections. Allegations of dark money, funding from anonymous donors started circulating, painting a picture of an organization that had outgrown its original mission and become a tool for corporate and political interests. The scrutiny intensified when leaked documents revealed internal communications that seemed to confirm favoritism in hiring practices and questionable spending decisions. Kirk and his team dismissed these reports as politically motivated attacks, arguing that the mainstream media was targeting them simply for being successful conservatives. But the damage to his reputation was undeniable. To many, the young crusader who had once represented authenticity was now seen as part of the establishment he had promised to challenge. The controversies didn't stop there. Charlie's personal conduct also began to attract attention. His strong opinions and confrontational style made him a favorite target for online critics. Every tweet, every podcast episode, every soundbite was dissected by journalists and social media users looking for contradictions. When he made statements on race, immigration, or gender, backlash was almost guaranteed. To his supporters, he was brave enough to say what others were too afraid to voice. To his opponents, he was dangerous, a figure fueling polarization and resentment among young Americans. One of the most heated criticisms came from university students themselves, the very demographic he claimed to represent. Many accused Turning Point USA of promoting division on campuses instead of dialogue. Protests erupted during some of his speaking tours, with students carrying signs that read, "Hate is not free speech," or "Turning Point turns truth into profit." At several events, tensions escalated into chaos, with police intervening to separate clashing groups of protesters and supporters. Instead of backing down, Charlie leaned into the chaos. He knew that every protest meant free publicity. Every angry headline made his brand stronger. But not all criticism came from the left. As his fame grew, even some conservative voices began to distance themselves from him. Traditionalists accused him of cheapening conservative values by turning politics into entertainment. They argued that his emphasis on viral content and cultural combat trivialized serious issues. Others believed he was becoming more interested in personal fame than ideological consistency. The older generation of conservatives, those who valued quiet diplomacy and intellectual debate, found themselves uncomfortable with Kirk's aggressive, media-first approach. Amid these ideological battles, Turning Point's relationships with universities became increasingly strained. Several institutions banned or restricted the group's activities, citing concerns about safety and misinformation. Kirk responded by accusing them of censorship and liberal bias, framing himself as a victim of the same political correctness he had spent years fighting against. Each confrontation became another episode in his growing narrative of battle between truth and tyranny, courage and suppression. As the spotlight grew harsher, journalists began uncovering deeper controversies. There were claims of racial insensitivity within the organization, stories of minority members feeling excluded or tokenized. In 2019, reports surfaced about Turning Point officials making offensive remarks at private events. The organization issued statements condemning such behavior, but critics argued that these were symptoms of a larger problem, a culture driven by ego and ideology rather than empathy and principle. The media frenzy reached new heights as Kirk's name became synonymous with America's political divide. On one side, he was hailed as a patriot defending free speech. On the other, he was painted as a manipulator of truth, a marketer of outrage. The more people criticized him, the more his followers adored him, a paradox that kept his brand alive. Every attack seemed to validate his message that the establishment feared him. At the heart of these controversies was a question that haunted Charlie's career. Where was the line between conviction and performance? Had he truly built a movement to inspire critical thinking among young Americans? Or had he built a machine to amplify his own influence? Those who once worked closely with him described a man torn between passion and pressure. They said he believed in his cause, but had become trapped by the very system he created. The expectations were relentless to grow, to fundraise, to stay relevant. He couldn't slow down without risking everything. Behind closed doors, friends noticed the toll it was taking on him. He was often exhausted, overworked, and increasingly paranoid about loyalty. He spoke of enemies, betrayal, and fake news with growing intensity. The constant online attacks and the unending need to defend his reputation left him emotionally drained. Yet in public, he remained unflinching, smiling, confident, armed with rehearsed lines and iron discipline. The show had to go on. Turning Point USA's critics accused it of being more interested in clout than change, and in some ways, they weren't entirely wrong. The organization had mastered the art of digital influence, but at the cost of nuance and civility. Kirk's style, direct, combative, unapologetic, was perfect for social media, but destructive for dialogue. He was both a product and a prisoner of his era, a man who understood that in the age of clicks and algorithms, outrage was the new currency. The controversies surrounding Charlie Kirk reveal a deeper truth about modern politics. The line between sincerity and self-promotion has never been thinner. His rise was fueled by authenticity, but sustaining that authenticity in an environment built on constant performance proved impossible. Supporters continued to see him as a fearless truth-teller. Critics continued to see him as a manipulator. Both were right in their own ways. By the time the 2020s began, Charlie's reputation was as polarized as the nation itself. To some, he was a symbol of courage, a young man who stood his ground in a world of conformity. To others, he was a cautionary tale, proof that when politics becomes performance, truth becomes collateral damage. The controversies didn't destroy Charlie Kirk, but they changed him. They hardened his tone, deepened his distrust, and turned his movement into a fortress. The boy who once dreamed of inspiring young minds was now a man fighting to preserve his own image. And in that transformation, the seeds of his eventual downfall had already been planted. By the early 2020s, the glow surrounding Charlie Kirk's name had started to dim. The once celebrated prodigy of conservative youth politics, the boy who had built an empire from his bedroom, was now facing a reality he had never fully prepared for: the slow, painful weight of backlash. Fame had come fast, too fast, and now it was beginning to devour him from the inside. What had started as admiration was turning into exhaustion, and the very audience that once lifted him was starting to question who he really was. Turning Point USA was still large, visible, and well-funded, but its internal stability was cracking. The movement that once thrived on youthful optimism was showing signs of fatigue. Chapters that used to grow organically now struggled to maintain engagement. Staff turnover increased, donors became more demanding, and the same controversies that had once fueled media attention now made sponsors nervous. Behind the scenes, Charlie's team worked overtime to control narratives, issue statements, and contain internal leaks. But in the digital age, secrets didn't stay buried for long. The political climate in America was shifting rapidly. The younger generation, the same demographic that Charlie had once inspired, was becoming more cynical, less trusting of institutions, and more allergic to traditional political rhetoric. His fiery speeches that once felt revolutionary now sounded rehearsed, predictable, even outdated. His followers wanted authenticity, but what they saw was a man trapped in his own image, a performer reciting old lines to an audience that had already moved on. Public sentiment began to turn. The media, once fascinated by his rise, now circled him like vultures. Every misstep, every careless tweet, every internal scandal became front-page news. Social media amplified his failures the same way it had amplified his success. Viral clips that once showed his confidence in debates were now used as memes mocking his arrogance. Hashtags that once celebrated him now called for boycotts. To his supporters, this was proof of a coordinated attempt to silence him. To his critics, it was karma catching up. Inside Turning Point, tensions rose. Some of his closest allies began questioning his leadership. They argued that the organization had become too centered on him, that it was losing its original mission. Younger activists wanted a fresh direction, a new tone, something less combative, more intellectual. But Charlie couldn't let go of control. The brand was his, the movement was his, and the idea of stepping back felt like surrender. He doubled down, giving more speeches, launching new initiatives, and fighting harder than ever to reclaim his relevance. Yet, the harder he pushed, the more isolated he became. The financial strain began to show as well. Several high-profile donors quietly withdrew their support, citing concerns about the organization's management and public image. Fundraising events that once sold out began to struggle with attendance. Internal memos revealed growing debts and delayed payments to contractors. The glamorous conferences with celebrity speakers continued, but behind the scenes, morale was collapsing. Employees described a culture of burnout and fear, where loyalty to Charlie was valued above competence. Some left quietly, others spoke to journalists, fueling even more negative headlines. Then came the investigations. Independent journalists and watchdog groups started publishing exposés about Turning Point's finances and political ties. Some reports alleged that funds were being diverted for purposes outside the organization's mission. Others accused the group of unethical campaign practices, blurring the line between nonprofit activism and political lobbying. Charlie denied everything, calling it a witch hunt designed to destroy him. But even his most loyal followers began to ask questions. The pressure took a toll on him personally. Those who saw him off camera during that time described a man visibly aged beyond his years. The once charismatic leader now looked tired, often restless, and easily irritable. He spoke less about ideas and more about enemies. His social media posts became increasingly defensive, often filled with anger and bitterness. The optimism that had once defined his speeches was replaced by warnings of conspiracies, betrayal, and persecution. He had become trapped in the echo chamber he had helped create. As his mental and emotional state deteriorated, so did his relationships. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues turned cold, and allies in the political world began avoiding association with him. Invitations to major events dwindled. The same media outlets that once called him a rising star now used headlines like "The Fall of Charlie Kirk" or "From Prodigy to Pariah." He had spent years building a fortress of influence, but now that fortress was crumbling from within. Despite everything, Charlie refused to quit. In interviews, he framed his struggles as proof of his courage, a man standing firm against a corrupt system. But even his speeches carried a different tone now. Less passion, more desperation. His audience could feel it. The energy that once filled rooms had faded. Applause came slower, shorter. There were no more standing ovations, only polite claps. The fire that once defined him was flickering. Then, in 2023, a series of leaked internal emails made headlines. The leaks exposed private conversations suggesting that Charlie and his inner circle had manipulated certain campus events to create viral controversies, staged confrontations, designed to gain media coverage. The revelations were devastating. For years, his enemies had accused him of manufacturing outrage, and now they had proof. His credibility was shattered. In the court of public opinion, intent mattered less than perception, and the perception was damning. Sponsors pulled out, some chapters disaffiliated, and public confidence in Turning Point USA plummeted. For the first time in his career, Charlie faced not just criticism, but abandonment. His social media following began to decline, and the digital army he had once commanded turned silent. Even among conservatives, his name became divisive, a reminder of ambition unchecked. Privately, he struggled with depression and exhaustion. Those who were still close to him said he spent hours staring at his phone, scrolling through the flood of comments attacking him. He couldn't escape it. The fame that had once empowered him now suffocated him. The irony was cruel. He had built his empire through the same digital platforms that now seemed to be destroying him. In his final years in the spotlight, Charlie tried to reinvent himself. He launched new projects, rebranded his messaging, and even softened his tone. But the world had already moved on. Younger voices had taken his place, using the same tools he had once mastered. His influence was fading, and he knew it. By 2024, Turning Point USA was a shadow of what it had once been. The conferences were smaller, the headlines fewer, and the energy gone. Charlie continued to appear in interviews, but his presence no longer commanded the same excitement. The media that once feared his influence now treated him as a relic of a bygone era, cautionary tale of how fame and ideology can consume a person. The fall of Charlie Kirk wasn't a single event, it was a slow unraveling, a series of small cracks that over time became impossible to ignore. He had spent his youth chasing influence, believing he could control it, but in the end, influence controlled him. His story became a modern parable about the cost of ambition, the fragility of reputation, and the unforgiving nature of the digital age. Still, even as he faded from the headlines, Charlie's legacy lingered not in policies or laws, but in culture. He had helped define a new era of political engagement, one where social media and spectacle replaced debate and dialogue. Whether one saw him as a visionary or a manipulator, no one could deny that he had changed the way a generation viewed politics. And as the lights dimmed and the applause quieted, one truth became painfully clear. Charlie Kirk had become both the architect and the casualty of his own creation. When the noise finally began to fade, and the spotlight that had once followed him so relentlessly started to dim, what remained of Charlie Kirk was not just a man, but a mirror reflection of a generation that grew up in the age of outrage, influence, and endless noise. The legacy he left behind was complex, layered with contradictions, triumphs, and regrets. Some called him a visionary, others a provocateur. But everyone agreed on one thing: Charlie Kirk had changed something deep within the American political landscape. He had left fingerprints that would not easily fade. His story was one of transformation, from a passionate teenager handing out flyers to a man who stood at the heart of national conversations. He had built an empire not with inherited wealth or academic prestige, but with sheer determination and the power of persuasion. In a country where the voices of youth were often dismissed, Charlie forced people to listen. He made politics accessible to a generation that had grown tired of speeches from gray-haired politicians in dusty suits. He spoke their language fast, emotional, digital. His phone was his megaphone, and the internet his battlefield. The rise of Turning Point USA marked a shift in how activism was understood. It wasn't about quiet meetings or academic debates anymore. It was about virality. Charlie understood before most that in a digital world, emotion beat logic every time. He used passion as a strategy, outrage as a currency, and spectacle as a weapon. It worked brilliantly until it didn't. His movement, once fueled by conviction, began to feed on division. What started as a call for free speech evolved into an echo chamber of slogans and counterattacks. Still, there was no denying that he had awakened something in the nation's youth, a sense of ownership over political ideas, whether people agreed with him or not. Historians looking back at his legacy often described him as a product of his time, the perfect embodiment of the social media generation's obsession with identity, visibility, and immediacy. He was the first of a new breed of political influencers, people who blurred the line between activism and entertainment. To his followers, this made him authentic, relatable, dynamic, unfiltered. To his critics, it made him dangerous, a salesman of ideology, a man who turned polarization into a business model. But to everyone who watched him rise, fall, and rise again in the headlines, he represented something undeniably real: the power and peril of modern influence. After his decline, when the media frenzy cooled and the controversies lost their sting, something interesting happened. Universities, journalists, and even his fiercest opponents began to study him, not to praise, but to understand. His speeches, his strategies, and his mistakes became case studies in political communication courses. Scholars dissected his rhetoric. Students analyzed his campaigns. Sociologists debated whether he had been a symptom or a cause of America's cultural divide. For better or worse, Charlie Kirk had become a chapter in history. His legacy wasn't just in what he said, but in what he symbolized. To some, he represented the courage to speak when silence was expected. To others, he represented the recklessness of a generation that valued attention over truth. In many ways, he was both the visionary and the cautionary tale. His life was proof that influence, once unleashed, cannot be controlled. He had built a machine of engagement, but the machine didn't stop when he wanted it to. It ran on its own, feeding on conflict, evolving beyond his control in private moments. Toward the later years of his life, those close to him said Charlie had begun to reflect differently. He spoke less about politics and more about people, about empathy, exhaustion, and the cost of always being right. The years of fighting had taken their toll, not just physically but spiritually. The constant need to win, to prove, to dominate every debate had drained something vital from him. "You can't change the world if you forget to listen to it," he once admitted quietly in an off-record conversation with a journalist who later shared the quote after his passing. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had built his reputation on strength. That vulnerability made him human again in the public's eyes. Even those who had once despised him began to see the tragedy beneath the bravado. Here was a man who had achieved everything: fame, power, wealth, and yet lost the very simplicity that had once fueled him. His legacy wasn't measured in victories or defeats, but in the conversations he sparked. He forced America to look at itself, to question what it believed, who it trusted, and how far it was willing to go in the name of ideology. Turning Point USA continued to exist after him, but it was different, less fiery, more corporate. It became a brand more than a movement, a remnant of what it once was. Some of his closest protégés went on to build their own organizations, often citing Charlie as both an inspiration and a warning. "He taught us how to build," one former colleague said, "but he also showed us what happens when you forget why you started building." His critics, meanwhile, never softened their stance. They saw his downfall as proof of their warnings that populism mixed with ego was a volatile combination. Editorials painted him as a modern Icarus, a young man who flew too close to the sun, driven by ambition, blinded by his own reflection. They weren't entirely wrong. Charlie had built his wings out of passion, charisma, and digital fire, and in the heat of fame, they melted. But perhaps the most striking part of his legacy was how deeply it resonated with those who grew up watching him. For a generation raised online, he was both a role model and a reflection of their struggles, the desire to be heard, the fear of being forgotten, the temptation to trade truth for visibility. His life became a metaphor for the digital age itself, brilliant, loud, fast, and ultimately fragile. When documentaries began revisiting his story years later, the tone had shifted. The mockery was gone, replaced by a kind of melancholy respect. They portrayed him not as a villain or hero, but as a human being caught in the storm of modern politics, a man who tried to master the media, but ended up consumed by it. His image, once polarizing, now carried a strange nostalgia. He had been controversial, yes, but he had also been alive in a way few dared to be unfiltered, unguarded, raw. His legacy can be summed up not in speeches or scandals, but in a single truth. Charlie Kirk made people feel something. Whether it was admiration, anger, hope, or disgust, he moved people, and that, in the end, is what all great communicators do. His life was a reminder that passion without balance burns bright but short, and that in the pursuit of influence, the line between purpose and performance can disappear before you even notice. And so, the story of Charlie Kirk became more than the story of a man. It became the story of a nation in transition, a story about the cost of ambition, the seduction of fame, and the eternal hunger to be seen, heard, and remembered. His legacy wasn't perfect, but it was undeniably real. And in an age defined by artificiality, maybe that's the most lasting achievement of all. When the news of Charlie Kirk's death broke in early 2025, America froze. For a moment, the noise of the political battlefield went silent. The hashtags, the talk shows, the comment sections all paused in disbelief. The man who had lived his life in constant motion, who had thrived on attention and confrontation, was suddenly gone. The headlines spread fast. Charlie Kirk dead at 31. No one seemed to know exactly how or why, only that the fire that had burned so fiercely had finally gone out. In the first hours after the announcement, confusion dominated. Reports conflicted. Some claimed it was a sudden medical condition. Others whispered about exhaustion, depression, or even foul play. The truth was unclear, and perhaps deliberately so. Those closest to him released a brief statement, calling it a tragic and unexpected loss, asking for privacy. But the public that had lived every twist of his career in real time demanded answers. In a world where nothing remained private, Charlie's death became the ultimate mystery. Tributes flooded social media. His supporters posted old clips of his speeches, moments of passion and conviction, captions filled with heartbreak. He stood up when no one else would, one wrote. They mocked him, but he never backed down. Others, less sympathetic, reacted with cold detachment, some even cruelty, proof that in death, as in life, Charlie Kirk remained polarizing. Hashtags like #RememberCharlieKirk and #KirkLegacy trended for days. Cable news ran special segments. Journalists recycled old interviews, and podcasts dedicated hours to dissecting his life and what it symbolized. As the initial shock faded, the questions began to multiply. What had really happened in his final months? Friends and colleagues painted conflicting pictures. Some said he had been more at peace recently, focusing on writing, family, and faith. Others hinted at growing isolation and disillusionment, that after years of fighting, the war inside him had become too heavy to bear. There were whispers that he had been struggling privately with anxiety, insomnia, and the pressure of living under constant scrutiny. He couldn't turn it off. One friend reportedly said he was addicted to the noise, the likes, the fights, the validation, and when the noise stopped, he didn't know who he was anymore. The final months of his life were marked by a strange quiet. His public appearances had become rare, his posts less frequent. Those who paid attention noticed the tone of his messages had changed. The confidence was still there, but the fire was dimmer. In one of his last speeches, delivered at a small event in Florida, he spoke not of politics, but of exhaustion and grace. "We spend our lives trying to prove something," he said softly. "But maybe the real victory is learning when to stop fighting." The audience clapped politely, unaware they were witnessing his last public words. The funeral was held privately, attended by family, close friends, and a handful of former colleagues. Outside, dozens of supporters gathered, holding candles and wearing Turning Point shirts. Some cried openly, others prayed. There were no cameras allowed, But photos leaked anyway: a closed casket draped with an American flag, flowers arranged in the shape of an eagle, and a framed portrait of Charlie smiling, microphone in hand. In death, the boyish charm that had captivated millions seemed frozen in time. In the weeks that followed, the conspiracy theories began. The internet, as it always does, turned his death into a spectacle. Some insisted that he had been silenced by political enemies. Others claimed he had faked his death and gone underground. Videos with titles like "The Truth About Charlie Kirk's Final Days" began circulating, racking up millions of views. The irony wasn't lost on anyone even in death. Charlie's story was being monetized and manipulated, just as he had once mastered doing to others. But beneath the noise, there was a quieter, more genuine grief. For many, his death symbolized the end of an era, the fall of a generation that had believed it could fight the world through screens and win. Supporters described feeling lost without his voice, while former critics confessed a strange emptiness. One journalist, who had covered his career for nearly a decade, wrote, "He frustrated me, inspired me, angered me, but he mattered. And that's more than most people can say." Turning Point USA continued, but something fundamental had changed. Without its founder's energy, the organization felt hollow, mechanical. Statements were polished, but lifeless. The conferences still happened, but the fire was gone. The students who once lined up to meet him now spoke of him like a legend, a mythic figure from their teenage years. His office remained untouched for months, his desk still cluttered with notebooks, coffee mugs, and handwritten quotes. A small brass plaque was added to the door, in memory of our founder and friend. As documentaries and retrospectives emerged, his story was retold in every imaginable tone: tragedy, cautionary tale, inspiration, controversy. Some framed him as a martyr of free speech, crushed by the same media machine he had challenged. Others portrayed him as a victim of his own ego, consumed by the attention he craved. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. He had been both. He was a man of conviction, but also of contradiction, brave and reckless, visionary and blind, sincere and performative. He had wanted to change the world, but in trying to do so, he lost himself within it. In the years that followed, his name remained a flashpoint in American discourse. Books were written, classes were taught, and politicians from both sides referenced him as a symbol. For conservatives, he became a rallying cry for youthful rebellion against the establishment. For liberals, he was a reminder of how easily truth could be twisted in the age of social media. Either way, he endured not as a saint or sinner, but as a story too human to be erased. The most haunting part of his legacy came from his own words. Months after his death, a recording surfaced, a podcast he had never released. In it, Charlie spoke candidly, almost wistfully, about his journey. "When I started," he said, "I thought influence meant power, but the more I had, the less I felt like myself. Everyone wanted a piece of me, my voice, my opinions, my mistakes. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a product." The clip went viral, shared across political lines. For the first time in years, people agreed on something. It sounded like a confession. A man finally speaking the truth, not to convince anyone, but to free himself. Today, Charlie Kirk's story stands as one of the most powerful parables of the digital age, a story of ambition and consequence, of brilliance and burnout. He was both a product of his time and a warning for those who would follow. His rise showed how far passion could take you. His fall showed how easily it could consume you. He embodied the dream of influence and the nightmare of never being able to escape it. In the end, perhaps his greatest impact wasn't political, but human. His life and death forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of fame, the addiction to attention, and the emptiness that can hide behind success. For some, he remains a hero. For others, a cautionary tale. But for everyone who remembers his name, Charlie Kirk remains a mirror reflecting the contradictions of our era, where the desire to be seen can be both a gift and a curse, and where the pursuit of truth can destroy the very souls who chase it too hard. And as his story fades into history, One line from that unreleased recording continues to echo across screens and memories, like a quiet whisper from a man who once shouted to the world, "I thought I was building a movement, but maybe I was just trying to be heard." In the end, the story of Charlie Kirk isn't just about politics. It's about the rise and collapse of a man who became both a symbol and a warning. He was the golden boy of conservative America, the loud voice that promised to revolutionize how young people saw their country. But behind the fame, the speeches, and the millions of followers, there were cracks that revealed something darker, something more human. From his explosive rise as a teenage prodigy to his shocking fall from grace, Charlie's journey was built on controversy, conflict, and control. The accusations of manipulation, the staged confrontations, financial scandals, and the emotional unraveling that followed, they all painted a portrait of a man consumed by his own creation. Was he a visionary who burned too brightly? Or just another product of the digital age, trapped by the same outrage he mastered? That's for you to decide. What we do know is that his story is far from simple. It's filled with unanswered questions, secrets buried behind closed doors, and a legacy that still divides millions. Some call him a martyr of free speech. Others, a manipulator of truth. But what if he was both? What if Charlie Kirk's greatest achievement and his ultimate downfall were the same, the power to make people believe? One thing is certain. His story changed the landscape of modern politics forever. And as the cameras fade and the headlines move on, we're left asking what really happened behind the empire he built. Stay with us until the very end, because the final revelation will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most controversial figures, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, not just to support this channel, but because on YouTube, your subscription tells the algorithm that this is the kind of truth worth showing to more people. Your engagement keeps independent stories like this alive. And if you want to help us go even further, click the Super Thanks button. It's a small gesture that helps us keep digging into the stories they don't want you to hear. But if you can't, that's okay. Just leave a comment below and tell us which part of Charlie Kirk's story shocked you the most. Every comment, every like, every share makes a difference. Because in the end, this isn't just about Charlie Kirk, it's about power, truth, and the price of chasing both. Watch until the end. The last truth will leave you absolutely speechless.